What is up, you guys? Glitchiz here, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm bringing you my updated Frost Vortex build for the Icy Rain. A lot of you guys enjoyed my Icy Rain build from the beta, but a few things have changed with full release, so I wanted to get an update out to you guys. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. I will preface this by saying that I'm going to add timestamps down below that break things up into the weapons in the mods, armor in the mods, and then go over things like the damage test itself, what food items are good, what deviant I recommend, as well as the Cradle Perks. So be sure to check those out down in the description if you want to jump to them quickly. But first thing we can go over is the weapons. So let's go to our gear. So for the secondary weapon, what I would recommend is one of two options. If you're going against single target elites or bosses, I'd recommend the recurve crossbow. This will apply the bullseye effect, which will make the enemy take 8% more damage if you hit a weak spot. It also will grant plus 30% bonus crit rate against enemies marked with the bullseye, which is really good for the Icy Rain because that will feed into our infinite ammo loop that I'll go over here in a minute. The other option, if you know you're going against larger packs of enemies that are a little bit weaker, would be the Wildfire Pistol. And the reason why this one is good is because it has a 60% chance to also proc the bullseye effect. But it has an 80% chance to spread that bullseye effect to an additional target within 15 meters upon hitting the first one. And I personally like to combo it with the Spreading Marks mod. That will make it jump to an even more third potential target if you defeat the first marked enemy, and the enemy doesn't have to be defeated with the wildfire. So you just mark it, swap to your main weapon, and then burn them down. And as long as they are marked and get killed by any weapon, that has potential to just chain effect those bullseyes to multiple enemies, one right after another. So good combination to do there. For the mod on the recurve crossbow, I like to run the vulnerability amplifier mod. That will make that 8% become 16% debuff. It adds another 8% to it, which is really nice. The secondary perks aren't as big of a deal because you're only getting one hit off, but you go something like crit damage, great one damage, things like that, just to pump out a little bit more min-max damage there. As for the main bread and butter weapon, we're going to be using the Icy Rain. The way this weapon works is it has several built-in perks. One of them increases the number of Frost Vortexes that we can create. And the reason why that's important is because if we go to the weapon and look at Frost Vortex, basically trapped enemies within a 4.5 meter radius, so it is an AoE effect of damage. Inflicts up to 30% psi intensity status damage per second for 4 seconds, and only up to 2 frost vortexes may exist at a time. With the Icy Rain, though, that increases to 3, which is nice. The additional damage is frost element. It cannot crit, cannot strike weak spots, and will not decay with distance, which is really good because we're typically within close range most of the time with an SMG. But if we're proccing crit rate and getting those frost vortexes up constantly, you can be further away and we won't lose any of our status damage based on range. It's going to be the flat rate the same no matter how far away you are, which is really, really cool. But the other two built-in perks that are really nice is critical hits grants a 40% chance to trigger Frost Vortex that we just went over. And when Frost Vortex is created, it auto reloads 15% of your bullets from reserves, which is really nice. That's kind of how we do the infinite ammo loop. We want to increase our crit rate as high as possible so that we basically create more frost vortexes, and the more frost vortexes that we make, the more ammunition we get back. So a really good secondary perk to look for on your mods potentially for this build is increased ammunition capacity, which is obviously going to refund more ammunition every time this little built-in perk procs, which is really good. But for the weapon itself, I like to run the Gold Cryoblast mod. Frost Vortex applies Frostbite, and when Frostbite is active, vulnerability is increased by another 4%. So if you combo this with the 16% that we're getting from the vulnerability bullseye effect from the crossbow, that means the enemies are now going to be taking 20% additional damage, and they get a 10% movement speed reduction, which is nice. This particular version of the mod that I got has built-in Frost Vortex damage as a secondary perk, which is kind of cool, as well as Frost Vortex trigger chance. You can shoot for more critical damage because this is going to be based around crit damage and crit rate. Great one damage is also something you want to look for to help burn down bosses better. So those are the 4 or 5 main ones you want to look for. The frost perks themselves, great one damage, ammunition capacity, and crit damage are the main things you want to look for. For the accessories, this is a little bit unique. Normally, most people would want to go with all gold mods, but that's not particularly the case you want to go with for the Icy Rain, and that is because the accuracy is terrible on this weapon. The bullet spread is all over the place, so you want to maximize the accuracy as much as possible. And the way you do that is with the following attachments. For the muzzle, I like to use the small break. It has the best accuracy bonus of any of the other attachments, so that's why I run that. The optical sight, you can use the gold one. I like the compact reflex sight because, again, that gives the highest accuracy and it's just one of the best looking reticles when you're ADSing. For the tactics attachment, I run the Cobra grip, not the tactical combine grip, because again, it has the highest accuracy of any of them. All these are going to be big losses to accuracy, so that's why I run that. And then for the magazine, you want to run the gold weighted SMG mag, because the higher our magazine capacity, the more ammunition we're going to get refunded every time we proc Frost Vortex. So that will just help our infinite ammo loop a little bit better. So make sure to run that. For the demo, I'm going to be running tungsten SMG ammunition. As for the calibration, the one that I run is heavy style, mainly because of the increased magazine capacity. We get plus 60% magazine capacity at the cost of 30% reload speed, but because we have infinite ammo, the reload speed isn't as big of a deal. You also want to get double crit rate on these, because the higher the crit rate, the higher the chance we're going to be proccing Frost Vortex, so obvious reason there. Another potential one that you could get if you have proper mods that can mitigate some of the magazine capacity loss would be the assault style calibration. That will increase our weapon damage a little bit more at the cost of accuracy, but like I said, at the cost of magazine capacity rather. But like I said, if you have the ammo capacity upgrades on your mods, you can mitigate that a little bit. So that is another potential option that you can run. Last but not least, for the weapon, it's a Frost Vortex build, so you got to run the Frozen Northern Pike. It is one of the only melee weapons that can actually proc Frost Vortex. Impacts and heavy attacks will freeze the primary target and generate a Frost Vortex. So really cool synergy with the rest of the build. You kind of have to run this. It just looks cool and it just goes along with the Frost Elemental damage theme. Moving on to the armor. Oh, and by the way, I run just a simple crit boost mod on this, just for higher damage. You could run a melee mod, things like that. But for the armor, we're going to have one key item. This is the most important armor piece, and that is the Frost Tactical Vest. The reason why this is important is because it generates ice spikes every time that we generate Frost Vortex that deal 100% psi intensity damage in the form of frost damage. So that's just a nice boost to our elemental damage every time we proc Frost Vortex. The other thing that you're going to want to try to run is 4-piece shelter set, but before I get into that, let's go over the mod for the chest piece. So that's pretty straightforward. I run the crit damage enhancement mod, just blue mod, for the increased crit rate, 2% there, and 12% crit damage. I also rolled this one with bonus crit damage and damage to great ones, which is obviously really good for bosses. But moving on, you can have any combination of 4-piece shelter set. The reason why the shelter set is good is because of the built-in perks. The first piece bonus isn't really that important. It's just a reduction to status damage, but the 2-piece bonus will give us a flat 8% increase to elemental damage. In this case, it'll be our frost damage. The 3-piece bonus basically gives us a perk where each weapon hit will grant 1 stack of deviant energy, and every stack of deviant energy grants us another 1% elemental damage. That can stack up to 20 times, so 20% more elemental damage there. Reloading removes half of those stacks, but it's not that big of a deal because we will barely ever have to reload with this. And then last but not least, the 4th perk is kind of cut off here, but what it does is it increases those max deviant energy stacks by 10, which means we can get up to 30% bonus elemental damage, and it grants 2 additional stacks when hitting a weak spot, which you always want to be aiming for. So that's going to ramp up those stacks much quicker, basically in double the time. So really good combo there. So 4-piece shelter set ideally is what you want to run. The one-off piece that you can run, in my opinion, I like to run a one-piece Bastille. That gives 10% more weapon damage as long as you're above 70% health. Some other options that you could run are the Lone Wolf Mask, which will give a 10% bonus to magazine capacity, so more ammunition, the better. That's another option you can run there. Or the Renegade one piece would be good, because that will increase your reload speed. So those are two potential options there. Personally, I like to run the Bastille one piece. But for the mods, for the helmet, I'm running the Gold Fateful Strike mod. Cannot deal weak spot damage, but it will increase our crit rate by 10%, allowing us to proc Frost Vortex more frequently, and our crit damage by 30%. This rolled with crit damage, magazine capacity, and Great One damage, so really good combo of sub perks there. Moving on to the mask, this is my one-piece Bastille mask. On the mask, I like to run the Lingering Frost mod. The longer the duration of a Frost Vortex, the higher its final damage, up to plus 60%. This is the actual Frost Vortex variation, so it has Frost Vortex damage built into it. Ideally, you would have more crit damage, damage to Great Ones, ammunition capacity, things like that. But the Frost perks themselves aren't bad either. If you don't have Lingering Frost, you could potentially run something like Targeted Strike to get 25% bonus crit rate or crit damage and 10% crit rate when hitting marked enemies with our bullseye. You could also run something like, if you don't have either of those, you could run something like Flame Resonance to get more status damage and increase our elemental damage if you're a little bit lower level. So those are some potential options there. Moving on to the chest piece, our Frost Tactical Vest. I already went over that. That's our blue crit damage enhancement mod. This will give us 2% crit rate and 12% crit damage. The pants is our Sheltered Pants. This, I like to run the Deadshot Violent gold mod. Each critical hit by a non-melee weapon grants plus 5% crit damage up to 45%. The effect is removed upon your next reload, but again, because we barely ever reload with this build, that won't really bother us. This has bonus crit damage and bonus damage to Great Ones, so good roll there. For the gloves, we have the Shelter Gloves, and I like to run the Crit Amplifier mod, preferably the Violent variation, because we want to stack crit rate and crit damage as much as possible. That will give us 10% crit rate and 15% crit damage, as well as crit damage as a sub perk. Ideally, I would get Great One damage on this or ammo capacity on this, so there is some room for improvement. And then last but not least, for the boots, this is our final 4-piece of the shelter set. And right now I have Slow and Steady on here, but ideally you would want to run Gold Covered Advance. The reason why I don't have Covered Advance is I just don't have one that has good sub perks on it at the moment. Both Covered Advance and Slow and Steady will both give you a 20% damage increase. The only difference is with Covered Advance, all you have to worry about is not getting hit for 4 seconds, and then you'll get that full 20% damage boost. Whereas with Slow and Steady, it is based off your health, so you'll get a 10% guaranteed boost at all times, but the only way you get the second 10% is if you're above 90% HP, which if you're like me, I'm almost never maxed out on my health. I get tagged every once in a while and I fail to use a stim and I just don't realize it. But if you're not above 90% health, you're going to be missing out on half the damage from this mod. So that's why I prefer Covered Advance. I'm just using this one for the demo and until I get a better Covered Advance mod, but both are potentially good options to pick. Moving on, the next thing I want to go over is the Cradle Perks. So these are obviously going to be really important. The main ones you're going to want to take, in my opinion, are Automatic Weapon Enhancement. This will give us 20% bonus damage when holding SMGs, as well as reload 10% of the magazine capacity from reserves upon defeating an enemy, which is going to happen a lot because we're going to be doing a ton of AoE damage. Moving on, this one is a flex one. I like to run Master Tactician for the 25% bonus damage to Great Ones by throwing a tactical item. If you're not going against a boss, you can swap this for something like Agility or Sprint for increased damage reduction or mobility. The next one I like to take is Deviation Master. I'm going to go over the preferred deviation here in a minute, but this one basically will give us another 50% damage boost as long as we're firing alongside our Deviant. So we'll just summon your Deviant for free extra damage. Next, I take Rapid Aid, reduces the cooldown of our healing items by 30% and increases their effectiveness by 15%. Moving on to the next row, I take Tactical Combo, increases weapon damage by 25% after switching weapons or reloading, which we will pretty much always be doing because we're going to be swapping to our crossbow or wildfire to do the bullseye. So we'll just swap there. And SMGs have quick reloads, so you'll get that buff every time you reload as well. Next, big one is status enhancement. After hitting a weak spot, status damage increases by another 25% for 3 seconds. So you ideally want to aim for the weak spot at all times. Moving on, we have the Sustained Suppression mod. Killing an enemy with continuous damage, such as Frost Vortex, increases the continuous damage of Frost Vortex in this case by another 20% for 10 seconds, and this can stack up to 3 times, so 60% potential more damage just to our Frost Vortex damage with this one Cradle perk. So really, really good, and probably the most important Cradle perk of all of them, at least for Frost Vortex. And then last but not least, I take Bounty Hunter after defeating a unit that you've marked. So in this case, with our bullseye, weapon damage is increased by 25% and weak spot damage is increased by 35% for another 15 seconds. So really good damage boosts, and the ones that I would recommend perk-wise for our Cradle. Moving on, before we go to the Deviation of Choice, I would recommend a few food items. The ones in particular that I like to take are going to be the Whimsical Drink. This will increase the status damage that we do by 25%. So really, really good elemental damage food item there. You can also take Honey Glazed Meat. This will increase our crit rate, which is obviously important on the Frost Vortex build to do the infinite ammo loop, by 15% when hitting enemies affected by Frost Vortex. Ones that aren't as important but are still decent is things like Shattered Bread. That'll give 25% flat weapon damage, so always good there. Some lower tier ones that aren't bad are something like the Stardust Pumpkin Salad to increase our crit damage by 15%. You could also do Bone-In Deviated Sausage if you're going against a boss for 15% bonus damage to bosses. So those are some lower level ones that are pretty good, but ideally the top two, in my opinion, that are good for at least Frost Vortex would definitely be the Whimsical Drink and the Honey Glazed Meat. So keep those on the back burner and try and farm up some of those ingredients if possible to make those. Last but not least, before we do the damage test, I'll go over the Deviation of Choice. And for Frost Vortex, in my opinion, there is no better deviant, or deviation rather, they changed the name, I always mix it up, than the Polar Jelly. You get this from the Cargo Shuffle like PvP event. They can get multiple of them per run if you're taking down enemies frequently. But why the Polar Jelly is so good is based on your skill rating. The Polar Jelly will increase the amount of frost damage received to enemies being hit by it by 27% or more. This percentage will increase the higher the deviation skill rating is, so keep that in mind. But there is 2 potential fire modes. The first one, called Frost Lash, allows you to grab the Polar Jelly and throw it at a distance, which will then knock back enemies, do an initial blast of damage, and then create a fortification that does a brief amount of AoE damage over time. And then the secondary one, which is probably the one you'll be using most often, is just the basic auto attack. This will drop the Polar Jelly basically right at your feet, doing continuous frost status damage to surrounding enemies and force them to move towards you, increasing frost damage, like I said, by 27% or more based on the skill rating. And if the Frost Vortexes are formed inside the radius of the Polar Jelly, you create additional ice spikes, which combos really well with our Frost Tactical Vest, which creates ice spikes as well. So it all synergizes together really nicely, and that's why it's my top pick for Frost builds. So that is the deviation I'd recommend. Last but not least, we can move on to the damage test. Now, the order of operations, in my opinion, to get the highest damage possible would be to 1, drink your food item. So we'll go ahead and pop that. But then for the damage rotation, you're going to want to summon your deviation first, because that will be out in the field the longest. It lasts for about 30 seconds. So you would drop your deviation. Then you want to take out your crossbow or your wildfire, hit the weak spot or just the body for the wildfire, and proc bullseye to add the vulnerability debuff. And then once they're vulnerable, that is when you would switch to your Icy Rain and just mow them down with infinite ammunition. So let's go ahead and do that now. Make sure we've got our crossbow reloaded. We're good to go. I'll just go ahead and drop the polar jelly and see what kind of damage we get. So there's our deviation. Proc bullseye. Looks like our polar jelly may have bugged out. I'll probably have to redo this. Let's recall it. It's the second time that happened. There's a bug with the test dummies right now where the AoE damage can actually, like, I don't know if he's falling through the floor or what, but we'll try that again here. Let him recharge. Probably do a quick cut here. Almost filled up. Alright, so let's try this again. Make sure my crossbow is reloaded. We're good. Deviation, proc bullseye. There's the damage. 45, 47, 48. And as long as you're hitting the head and proccing those frost vortexes, you can basically just fire forever. So we're above 1,000,000 damage now. I could keep going forever, but I don't want to waste damage. But as you can see, tons of sustained damage, 1.3 million damage. We hit almost 50,000 DPS, and that wasn't just on one target. We were getting 35 to 40k DPS on the secondary target as well. So picture that on all surrounding enemies. So even though it's an SMG and we've don't got a high, basically single target boss damage, you can see that it does really good, basically base damage for an AoE build. Yeah, that is pretty much it. Decent, fun build, infinite ammunition. We get AoE. It's super good for clearing silos because you never have to reload and you just burn down dozens of enemies all at the same time. You don't have to take them out one by one. So fun little build. And like I said, I will be making, because I know a lot of people are going to be curious, an alternate variation of this build, which kind of builds more focused into status damage buffs for the Abyss Glance legendary assault rifle. So keep an eye out for that. I am going on vacation this weekend, won't be back to the middle of the week, so it may take a little time for the next video to get out, but hopefully this one will hold you guys over until then. But if you enjoyed it, be sure to smash that like button, comment down below. I appreciate all of your guys' feedback. Also, if you want to keep up to date with my future content, consider subscribing and turn on that notification bell. And then lastly, if you want to join a killer community of like-minded gamers, feel free to check the links down in the description and join us on the Discord. We've got almost 1,000 members in there now, many of which are playing Once Human. So hopefully you jump in and we see you guys around here soon. But until the next one, hope everyone has a great day, and we'll see you all later.